circa 336 BC. Corinth. The sun is a white-hot hammer beating down on the dust of the Kronion Gymnasium, baking the cracked earth and the clay tiles of the rooftops. The air is thick with the smells of hot stone, olive oil, and sweat. A low murmur hums through the assembled crowd, the sound of a beehive disturbed, a mixture of awe, fear, and nervous excitement. This is the narrative of a collision, not of armies, but of universes. At the center of the attention stands a figure radiating a light so bright it seems to bend the very air around him. Alexander, son of Philip, the newly minted hegemon of Greece, a young man who is no longer a prince, but a living storm about to break upon the world. His armor, polished bronze and iron, gleams with a terrifying brilliance, each plate a mirror reflecting a tiny, distorted image of the adoring, terrified faces around him. He is surrounded by his generals, men with hard eyes and scarred knuckles, the architects of his father's triumph, and now the tools of his own. They are a wall of muscle and steel, their every posture screaming power, ambition, and the casual violence that has forged their new world. And before this living God, this nexus of world historical power, lies his opposite, a creature of the earth. In the full, glorious, and unforgiving light of the Greek sun, an old man is reclining, his body gnarled like an ancient olive root, his skin tanned to the color of leather and caked with the dust of the street. He lies beside his home, a massive ceramic storage jar, a pythos, discarded by some merchant, and now the only shelter he claims. This is Diogenes of Sinope, the man they call the dog, and he is doing nothing more than enjoying the warmth of the sun on his naked, aging body. The silence that falls as Alexander approaches is not one of peace, but of immense, crushing pressure. The world holds its breath. The young king, the master of legions, the future conqueror of Persia, looks down at the philosopher, the master of nothing, and with a voice accustomed to shaking nations, he offers the ultimate gift. Ask of me any boon, and you shall have it. The crowd leans in, expecting a plea for gold, for pardon, for a position at court. Diogenes, however, barely stirs. He squints up, his eyes two chips of obsidian in his weathered face, and his voice, raspy from disuse and cheap wine, cuts through the divine aura of the king with the simple, devastating power of truth. Stand out of my light, he says. In that moment, the skewer of our story is forged. This was the saga of the man who turned his back on the world to own it. This is the saga of Diogenes of Sinope, the man who renounced everything to find the one thing that even a king could not give him, and more importantly, could not take away. To understand this philosopher, we must first understand the central, dramatic paradox of his life, a riddle that has echoed through the millennia. Why would a man of profound intellect, a mind sharp enough to cut through the most complex sophistry, choose to live in a discarded clay pot, to own nothing but a cloak and a staff, and to behave like a stray dog in the public squares of the most civilized cities in the world? How did this man, this homeless exile, find a freedom so absolute that he could look upon the master of the world, Alexander the Great, and see only a shadow blocking the sun? This is the core question that drives his narrative. It is not a story of a simple eccentric, nor a tale of a madman driven to the fringes of society. It is the story of a deliberate and radical experiment in human liberty, a philosophical performance of immense courage and breathtaking audacity. Diogenes' life was his argument, and every shocking act, his public shamelessness, his biting wit, his relentless mockery of the powerful and the pious, was a line in his manifesto. He lived in a time of profound crisis, when the old certainties were crumbling, and he responded not by building new systems, but by tearing down the old ones with the savage joy of a demolition expert. He sought to discover the absolute minimum a human being needs for happiness, to strip away every layer of social convention, every ounce of material desire, every shred of false modesty, until all that was left was the unadorned, unbreakable core of the human spirit. He was not just a thinker, he was a warrior, and his battlefield was the human soul. His story forces us to confront the most uncomfortable of questions. What is wealth? What is power? What is freedom? And are the things we strive for our entire lives, comfort, status, respectability, actually the very chains that bind us? To understand the man in the barrel, we must first understand the world that drove him there, a world so much like our own, teetering on the brink of chaos and desperate for a truth that no amount of gold could buy. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the 4th century before our era, a world convulsing in the throes of a profound and violent transformation. The golden age of Periclean Athens was a fading memory, a ghost haunting the stones of a city exhausted by decades of ruinous conflict. The Peloponnesian War, that great civil war of the Hellenic soul, had not ended with a victor, but had simply left everyone defeated, bleeding out their wealth, their manpower, and most importantly, their faith in the democratic ideal of the polis. The Greek city-state, once the nucleus of civilization, the bedrock of identity for every citizen, was proving itself to be a cage, too small and too quarrelsome to survive in the new, brutal landscape. This was a world adrift. Into this vacuum of power and purpose stormed a new force from the north, a force the sophisticated Athenians had long dismissed as barbaric. From the rugged lands of Macedon, King Philip II, a military genius and a master of brutal diplomacy, forged a professional army, the likes of which the world had never seen. The Macedonian phalanx, with its 18-foot sarissas, was not just a new weapon. It was a new political reality, a steel-tipped argument that could not be refuted. Philip rolled over the fractured Greek states one by one, culminating in the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, the moment the fierce independence of the Greek polis was effectively extinguished forever. It was a cultural and psychological shockwave. The world was suddenly larger, more terrifying, and the individual felt smaller, more powerless than ever before. This climate of existential dread and political impotence created a desperate hunger for new answers. The old gods of Olympus seemed distant and indifferent. The old philosophies, tied to the fate of the city-state, felt inadequate. It was in this fertile soil of anxiety that new schools of thought began to sprout like weeds in the ruins of a temple. The Stoics would later offer fortitude in the face of fate. The Epicureans would propose a retreat into quiet pleasure. But before them came the most radical, the most shocking response of all: cynicism. And Diogenes would become its most notorious and purest practitioner, a living embodiment of the age's disillusionment. He looked at the collapsing world, at the self-important politicians, and the fearful masses, and he did not weep. He laughed, for he understood a secret that the rest of the world had forgotten. The only kingdom worth ruling is the one within. The story of this king of the inner self begins not in the philosophical heart of Athens, but on the wild periphery of the Greek world, in the bustling port city of Sinope, on the coast of the Black Sea. Imagine the place, a crossroads of civilizations, a riot of smells, the sharp tang of salt and fish from the docks, the scent of cedarwood and spices from Anatolian caravans, the metallic odor of money being counted in the marketplace. Sinope was a place of commerce, of pragmatism, of constant cultural exchange, a city that looked both to the sophisticated Hellenic world and to the vast, mysterious lands of the East. It was here, in this crucible of cultures, that Diogenes was born, the son of a man named Hecesias. His father was not a philosopher or a general. He was a mint master, a banker, a man whose entire existence revolved around the most powerful symbol of social convention: money. This is the first great irony of our story. The man who would spend his life arguing that money was worthless grew up surrounded by its creation. We can picture the young Diogenes in his father's workshop, the air ringing with the rhythmic clang of hammers on metal, the heat of the forge, the precise, disciplined work of stamping images of gods and heroes onto discs of silver and bronze. This was his first education, not in Plato's abstract forms, but in the very concrete form of nomisma, a word in Greek that meant not only coin, but also custom or convention. The coin of the realm and the customs of the realm were one and the same, the agreed-upon fiction that holds a society together. And then, the catastrophe. The historical record is sparse, but the charge, according to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, was sensational. Hecesias and his son were accused of debasing the currency, of adulterating the coinage. Whether they were counterfeiting, shaving metal from the edges, or involved in some political scheme against the city's pro-Persian faction, we may never know. But the outcome was absolute: public disgrace, condemnation, and exile. For a citizen of a Greek polis, exile was a form of living death. It was to be stripped of your identity, your property, your rights, your very connection to the human world. This was the ancestral curse, the foundational trauma that would forge Diogenes' character. He was betrayed by the very system his father served. The nomisma, the customs, and the currency had declared him worthless. This shame, this burning humiliation, became the furnace in which his entire philosophy would be tempered. He had seen the ultimate truth of society. Its values were as easily manipulated and debased as a piece of silver. Cast out from Sinope, stripped of his name, his home, and his future, the young Diogenes did what countless desperate souls in the ancient world did. He sought guidance from the divine. He embarked on a pilgrimage to the center of the world, to the sacred precinct of Delphi, nestled in the misty slopes of Mount Parnassus. One must imagine that journey: the long, dusty roads, the vulnerability of a man with no city to call his own, a man who was legally nobody. He arrived not as a wealthy supplicant, seeking a favorable prophecy for a business venture, but as a broken man seeking the meaning of his own ruin. At Delphi, he would have undergone the ritual purifications, the air thick with the scent of burning laurel and the low chanting of priests. He would have descended into the heart of the temple of Apollo, into the presence of the Pythia, the priestess who was said to channel the voice of the god himself. The question he posed to the oracle is lost to history, but we can surmise its desperate nature. What am I to do? The answer he received was as cryptic and as powerful as a lightning strike, a single phrase that would become the axis upon which his life would turn. Paracharatein to nomitsma. The phrase had a brutally literal meaning, the very crime for which he had been exiled: deface the currency. For a moment, one can imagine his confusion, his despair. Was the god mocking him? Was he being commanded to become a common criminal, to fulfill the destiny that his city had already assigned to him? But in that moment of crisis, in the spiritually charged atmosphere of Delphi, Diogenes experienced a profound, life-altering revelation. He understood that the oracle was not speaking of metal coins. It was a metaphor of cosmic significance. The currency he was being commanded to deface was not the silver of Sinope, but the nomisma of all human society. Its customs, its conventions, its traditions, its empty honors, its false hierarchies, its hollow virtues. The god was not telling him to break the law. He was telling him to break all the laws that governed human behavior. He was being given a divine sanction for a rebellion against civilization itself. This was the moment the disgraced exile was reborn as a philosopher. The shame of his past was not a stain, but a mission. He would take the insult hurled at him, currency debaser, and wear it as a badge of honor. He would dedicate his life to exposing the fraudulent values of the world, to holding up a mirror to society and showing it the ugliness and absurdity it tried so hard to conceal. From Delphi, he walked not as an outcast, but as a man with a holy purpose, a soldier of truth armed with a divine command to wage war on lies. What was the inner demon that drove this man to such an extreme, uncompromising path? To understand Diogenes, we must look beyond the philosophical doctrines and into the crucible of human emotion, to the secret motivation that often lies hidden beneath the grandest of missions. The trauma of his exile from Sinope was not merely a political or social event. It was a profound psychological wound. It was the ultimate betrayal. He and his father, servants of the city's economic heart, were cast out, their names erased, their honor destroyed. This experience of being declared worthless by the collective, of having everything, home, family, reputation, security, stripped away in an instant, instilled in him a deep-seated and ferocious contempt for the very concept of social value. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that everything society can give you, it can also take away. Your reputation is merely the opinion of others. Your wealth is subject to the whims of fortune. Your status is a fragile illusion. This ghost of betrayal haunted him, fueling a relentless quest to find something, anything, that was truly his own. Something that could not be confiscated at the city gates. His philosophy was, in essence, a scorched earth defense mechanism. If he owned nothing, nothing could be stolen from him. If he desired no honors, he could not be humiliated by their withdrawal. If he embraced shame, no insult could touch him. He was building a fortress of the self, and the foundation of that fortress was the absolute rejection of all external validation. This was his inner demon, a burning, unquenchable need to prove that he did not need the world that had rejected him. Every public act of defiance, every witty retort to a king, every moment spent in his clay jar was a declaration of independence, a shout of defiance back at the ghosts of Sinope. He was replaying the scene of his exile over and over, but this time he was in control. He was the one choosing to be an outcast. He was the one defining the terms of his existence. It was a philosophy born not in the quiet contemplation of a scholar's study, but in the fire of personal grievance. He sought not tranquility, but invulnerability. And in his search for a value that was immune to the betrayals of the world, he discovered the one thing that lay entirely within his own power, his own mind, his own virtue, and his own freedom from want. This became his treasure, the only currency that couldn't be debased. Armed with a divine mission from Delphi and fueled by the inner fire of his personal trauma, Diogenes made his way to the epicenter of the Greek intellectual world, Athens. He arrived as a nobody, an exile from a provincial city, with no money, no connections, and no reputation other than the one he had left in disgrace. But he was drawn to Athens not by the promise of wealth or comfort, but by the scent of philosophical battle. The city was a cacophony of competing ideas, the agora a battleground where sophists, Platonists, and rhetoricians vied for the attention of the city's youth. In this chaotic intellectual marketplace, Diogenes sought out the one man who seemed as disgusted with the world as he was: Antisthenes. This was the fateful encounter that would give shape and substance to Diogenes's raw, untutored rebellion. Antisthenes was a fascinating and contradictory figure. A former student of the great Socrates, he had been present at his master's death, an event that had filled him with a grim, ascetic fervor. While Plato had taken Socrates' ideas and woven them into a grand, metaphysical tapestry, Antisthenes had seized upon his master's disdain for material comfort and his emphasis on virtue. He preached a philosophy of self-sufficiency, autarkia, and laborious effort, ponos, arguing that virtue was the only good and could be taught. Yet, he was a harsh, solitary man, so grim and misanthropic that he was nicknamed the Absolute Dog. When Diogenes, the young, eager exile, presented himself as a potential student, Antisthenes, true to his nature, rejected him outright. Diogenes persisted. Antisthenes threatened him. Finally, according to legend, Antisthenes raised his heavy staff to strike the bothersome newcomer. Diogenes did not flinch. He simply bowed his head and said, "Strike, for you will find no wood hard enough to drive me away." In that moment, the old misanthrope recognized a spirit as stubborn and as committed as his own. Antisthenes had found his one true disciple, and Diogenes had found his unwilling mentor. Antisthenes provided the Socratic lineage and the philosophical vocabulary, the concepts of virtue, self-sufficiency, and living in accordance with nature. But Diogenes would take these abstract ideas and ignite them with his own explosive personality. He would transform the dour, intellectual asceticism of Antisthenes into a vibrant, outrageous, and unforgettable public performance. He would not just write about the dog's life, he would live it. The meeting with the mad Socrates, as Plato derisively called Antisthenes, was the final piece of the puzzle. The disgraced son of a banker, armed with a prophecy from a god and a philosophy from a misanthrope, was now ready to begin his life's work: to hold a lantern to the face of the world and demand that it look at itself. The first step in Diogenes' war against convention was the most radical and the most symbolic: the choice of his dwelling. He did not simply choose a life of poverty, he curated it, he weaponized it, and he turned it into a piece of living theater. He rejected the very concept of a house, of a private space that separates man from his fellow man and from nature. Instead, he took up residence in a pythos, a massive earthenware jar, the kind used in ancient Athens for storing wine, oil, or grain. This was not a barrel in the modern sense, but a colossal piece of pottery, large enough for a man to sleep in, a ceramic womb returned to the earth. The location he chose was as important as the dwelling itself: the Agora of Athens, the bustling, chaotic heart of the city. He placed his home in the middle of the marketplace, amidst the temples, the law courts, and the stalls of the merchants. This was a declaration. He was refusing to be hidden away, to be a marginal figure. He was making his poverty, his homelessness, a public spectacle, a constant, unavoidable reproach to the citizens of Athens as they went about their daily business of accumulating wealth and status. The physical reality of this life is difficult for us to imagine. The cold of the winter nights, the damp seeping into his bones, the relentless heat of the summer sun beating down on his ceramic shell, the constant hunger, a gnawing ache that he would assuage by begging, or as he put it, demanding his due from his debtors. The scorn and ridicule of the crowds, the children who threw stones at his jar, the respectable citizens who looked upon him with a mixture of pity and disgust. But for Diogenes, These hardships were not a bug, they were the feature. They were the very tools of his philosophy, a form of spiritual training he called ascesis. He was deliberately hardening his body against pleasure and pain, teaching himself to be indifferent to the comforts that enslave other men. He was a soldier, training for a war, and his enemy was desire itself. His life in the Pythos was the first and most powerful of his defacements. He was taking the most basic human need, the need for shelter, and demonstrating that it was, in fact, a luxury, a convention that could be discarded. He was showing the world that a man's worth was not determined by the size of his house, but by the strength of his soul. And from the mouth of his ceramic home, he began to bark, bite, and snarl at the follies of the world, earning the nickname that he would embrace with pride, the dog. His primary philosophical antagonist, the antithesis to his entire way of being, was not a king or a general, but a fellow philosopher, the great Plato. The clash between Diogenes and Plato was more than just a clash of two personalities. It was a fundamental conflict between two opposing ways of understanding reality, a battle for the very soul of philosophy. Plato, the aristocratic, wealthy, and highly respected head of the academy, was the embodiment of everything Diogenes despised. He was a man of theories, of abstractions, a thinker who located ultimate reality not in the messy, tangible world we can see and touch, but in a transcendent, invisible world of forms. For Plato, the physical world was merely a shadow, a pale imitation of these perfect, eternal ideas, the form of the good, the form of justice, the form of the table. His philosophy was an ascent, a turning away from the body and the senses toward the pure, disembodied realm of the intellect. His academy was a refined, cloistered environment where well-heeled young men could contemplate these lofty concepts, far removed from the dirt and noise of the Athenian marketplace. Diogenes saw this entire enterprise as a dangerous and cowardly fraud. To him, Plato's philosophy was an abdication of responsibility, a flight from the harsh but beautiful reality of lived experience. He called Plato's lectures a waste of time. He saw the world of forms as a hollow fantasy, a set of intellectual toys for the idle rich. For Diogenes, the only reality was the one right in front of him: the warmth of the sun, the taste of a lentil, the pain of a stone striking his leg, the urgent needs of his own body. His philosophy was a radical materialism, a celebration of the concrete, the immediate, and the physical. He was the philosopher of the earth, while Plato was the philosopher of the heavens. This opposition was total. Plato represented idealism, Diogenes, realism. Plato sought order and harmony. Diogenes embraced chaos and disruption. Plato wrote elegant, complex dialogues. Diogenes communicated in short, savage aphorisms and shocking public acts. The academy was a place of intellectual refinement. The agora was Diogenes' stage for his raw, unfiltered performance of truth. It was a battle between the philosopher as aristocrat and the philosopher as outcast, the thinker as architect of ideal societies, and the thinker as a bomb thrower, determined to blow up the foundations of the current one. And Diogenes would not be content to simply disagree with Plato from afar. He would take the fight directly to the gates of the academy itself. The war between the philosopher of the gutter and the philosopher of the heavens was not fought in quiet debate, but in acts of spectacular intellectual vandalism. The most famous of these was Diogenes' brilliant and absurd counterargument to one of Plato's most cherished definitions. Inside the hallowed, orderly world of the academy, Plato had been lecturing his students, attempting to distill the complex essence of humanity into a neat, tidy formula. After much deliberation, He had offered a definition that was met with great applause and satisfaction. Man, he declared, is a biped without feathers. It was a classic Platonic exercise, abstract, categorical, and utterly detached from the lived reality of what a human being is. For Plato, this definition successfully separated humans from both the four-legged beasts and the feathered birds. Diogenes heard of this definition, and he saw his opportunity. This was the epitome of the kind of useless, intellectual hair-splitting that he believed was poisoning the well of true philosophy. He didn't write a lengthy treatise refuting it. He didn't engage in a formal debate. He did something far more devastating. He went to the marketplace, found a chicken, and painstakingly plucked it of all its feathers. Then, holding the squawking, naked, and frankly ridiculous-looking bird aloft, he strode to the academy, burst into the middle of Plato's lecture, and hurled the plucked chicken at the feet of the master's students. "Behold," Diogenes roared, presenting the pathetic creature to the astonished academics, "I have brought you Plato's man." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. In a single, hilarious, and unforgettable gesture, he had completely demolished the definition. He had shown, more powerfully than any logical argument could, the absurdity of trying to capture the essence of a living thing in a sterile formula. He had exposed the fatal flaw in Plato's method, its complete and utter divorce from the real world. The students, and later all of Athens, erupted in laughter. Plato was publicly humiliated, forced to go back and add a pathetic and clumsy addendum to his definition. With broad, flat nails. But the damage was done. This was Diogenes' philosophical method in a nutshell, not to win the argument, but to blow it up. He used satire as a weapon, absurdity as a tool of enlightenment. The incident of the plucked chicken cemented his reputation. He was not just a beggar or an eccentric. He was a brilliant and fearless critic, a man who could expose the foolishness of the wisest men in Greece with nothing more than a bird and a wicked sense of humor. This was his first major victory in the war, to deface the currency of false ideas. Having demonstrated the bankruptcy of elite intellectualism, Diogenes turned his attention to an even more foundational set of social conventions, those governing shame and public decency. He understood that society controls its members not just through laws and force, but through a powerful and pervasive web of unwritten rules about what is acceptable, what is proper, and what is shameful. He saw these rules of etiquette and modesty as arbitrary and unnatural, chains on the human spirit forged by fear and hypocrisy. His response was to systematically break every single one of them in the most public and shocking way possible. He made the Athenian agora his stage for a masterclass in philosophical shamelessness, an idea. He would eat in the marketplace, something that was considered deeply improper, arguing that if it wasn't wrong to be hungry, it wasn't wrong to eat when and where one was hungry. His logic was brutally simple and impossible to refute. He would urinate on the people who insulted him, turning their scorn back on them in the most visceral way imaginable. When the Athenians were horrified, he would simply ask why it was wrong to do in public what everyone did in private. His most notorious act, however, was his habit of masturbating in public. When citizens recoiled in disgust, he would calmly express his regret. If only it were so easy to banish hunger by rubbing one's belly. This was not the act of a madman or a pervert. It was a calculated philosophical statement. Diogenes was using his own body as a living argument. He was forcing the Athenians to confront the arbitrariness of their own taboos. By performing these natural, necessary bodily functions in public, he was challenging the very distinction between public and private, natural and conventional. He was arguing that shame is not an innate human emotion, but a social construct, a tool used to enforce conformity. By living like a dog, who eats, sleeps, and procreates wherever the need arises, without a shred of shame. He was advocating for a life lived according to nature, free from the artificial constraints of civilization. This was his opportunity. Seized from the chaos of his own shamelessness, he turned the revulsion of the crowd into a mirror, forcing them to question why they were so disgusted. He was showing them that their sense of propriety was a cage, and he, the shameless dog, was the only truly free man among them. He wielded his own obscenity as a surgeon wields a scalpel, cutting away the tumors of hypocrisy from the body of the city-state. Of all the scenes in the grand theater of Diogenes' life, one image stands out. A single act of performance art so powerful it has become a timeless symbol of philosophical defiance. This was his greatest triumph. The moment his critique of society was distilled into a single, unforgettable gesture. We must picture the scene, the Athenian agora, at noon on a bright, sunlit day. The marketplace is thronged with people, merchants haggling over prices, politicians currying favor, young men arguing about philosophy, a chaotic, vibrant river of humanity. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the crowd, creating a stir wherever he goes. It is Diogenes, but he is engaged in an act of supreme absurdity. In the full glare of the midday sun, he is walking slowly, deliberately, through the square, holding a lit lantern. He peers into the faces of the people he passes, holding the lamp up to them as if trying to illuminate something hidden in the darkness. The scene is so bizarre, so illogical, that people stop what they are doing and stare. A crowd gathers. Someone, inevitably, asks the obvious question. "Diogenes, what are you doing? Why are you carrying a lamp in the middle of the day?" Diogenes stops. He lifts the lantern high, its small, pathetic flame almost invisible against the brilliance of the sun, and he gazes out at the sea of curious, mocking, and confused faces. Then, with a voice full of theatrical gravity and profound disappointment, he delivers the line that will make him immortal. "I am searching for an honest man." In some versions of the story, he says simply, "I am searching for a man." The effect is the same. It is a moment of pure, devastating genius. With a single sentence, he passes judgment on all of Athens, on all of humanity. He implies that in this great city, this cradle of democracy and philosophy, this place teeming with thousands of souls, there is not a single, true, authentic human being to be found. They are all shadows, puppets, actors playing roles, their true selves lost in the pursuit of wealth, fame, and power. The gesture is a masterstroke of satire. The absurdity of using a lamp in daylight perfectly mirrors the absurdity of a society that claims to be enlightened, but is, in his view, completely blind to the truth. He doesn't need to name names or make specific accusations. The lantern accuses everyone. It forces every person in the crowd, and every person who has heard the story since, to ask themselves, am I the man he is looking for? Or am I, too, one of the shadows? This was the climax of his public theater, the ultimate defacement of society's proudest creation, the Athenian citizen. He held a light up to their world, and he found it empty. To the outside world, this was the peak of his notoriety, the act of a madman or a brilliant satirist. But to understand Diogenes, we must try to reconstruct the psychology of this triumph, the inner state of the man who had deliberately chosen a life of squalor and scorn. What he found in his pathos was not misery, but a state of profound and joyful liberation. This was his moment of hubris, but it was a hubris of a completely inverted kind. While a normal man's hubris comes from having everything, Diogenes's came from having nothing. He had successfully completed the most radical spiritual exercise imaginable. He had systematically amputated every desire, every attachment, every vulnerability that makes a person a slave to fortune. He saw the world around him as a world of madmen, people frantically chasing phantoms. He saw the merchant, anxious about his cargo, the general, fearful of his rival, the politician, terrified of public opinion. He saw them all as slaves, bound by 1,000 invisible threads of fear and desire. And he, the man with nothing, was the only free man among them. He had achieved a state of perfect self-sufficiency, or autarkeia. He needed nothing that the world could provide. The sun warmed him. The public fountains gave him drink. A discarded crust of bread was a feast. By reducing his needs to the absolute biological minimum, he had made himself invulnerable. This was his kingdom, and it was a kingdom that could not be conquered. This psychological state, this joy in having nothing, was the core of his power. It is what allowed him to speak truth to power without fear. When you have nothing to lose, you are free to say anything. He could insult the most powerful men in Athens because their threats were meaningless to him. What could they do to him? Fine him? He had no money. Imprison him? His life was already a form of voluntary imprisonment. Exile him? He was already an exile who declared himself a citizen of the world. Kill him? He did not fear death. This psychological invulnerability was his ultimate triumph. He saw his own life not as a deprivation, but as the pinnacle of human achievement. He was not just surviving, he was thriving, in a way that no one else could understand. He was Sulla Felix in reverse, not the man fortunate in all his acquisitions, but the man fortunate in all his renunciations. He had looked into the abyss of non-possession, and he had found not emptiness, but absolute freedom. While Diogenes fought his philosophical battles in the streets of Athens, the entire Greek world was being reshaped by a force of unimaginable ambition and power. This force was the sworn, symbolic enemy of everything Diogenes stood for, the ultimate antagonist to his philosophy of self-sufficiency. This enemy was the insatiable desire for conquest and worldly power, and it had a name. First, Philip of Macedon, and then his son, Alexander. The personal drama of this Macedonian dynasty was the macro-level expression of the very desires Diogenes was fighting to extinguish within himself. Philip was a man of boundless ambition, a brilliant but brutal king who took a backwater kingdom and, through constant warfare, cunning diplomacy, and sheer force of will, turned it into the master of Greece. His life was a testament to the power of desire, the relentless pursuit of more. More land, more power, more glory. He was assassinated in 336 BC, but his ambition did not die with him. It was inherited, magnified, and unleashed upon the world by his son, Alexander. If Diogenes was the man who wanted nothing, Alexander was the man who wanted everything. His personal drama was a relentless, forward-moving quest to conquer, to unify, to reach the very ends of the earth. He was driven by what the Greeks called pothos, a powerful, almost divine longing for what is beyond. He wept when he heard the philosopher Anaxarchus speak of infinite worlds, lamenting that he had not yet conquered even one. This was the polar opposite of Diogenes' autarkeia. The two men represented the two extremes of the human condition, the man who finds the world within himself, and the man who seeks to possess the entire world outside himself. The shadow of Alexander loomed large over the era. His conquests shattered the old world order, destroyed the independence of the city-states, and created a new, vast, multicultural empire. This new world, the Hellenistic world, was a place of vast fortunes and immense power, but also of profound alienation and uncertainty for the individual. In a way, Alexander's conquests created the very conditions that made Diogenes' philosophy so appealing to so many. As the city-state died, the need for an inner citadel, a personal philosophy of resilience, became more urgent than ever. The chemistry between Diogenes and Alexander, even in their single legendary encounter, was that of two masters of their own universes, two men who had achieved the pinnacle of power, but in radically different currencies. Alexander had mastered the world of men and maps. Diogenes had mastered the world of desire and fear. While kings and conquerors were building empires of stone and territory, Diogenes was engaged in his own project of construction. His peacetime work was not about creating laws or institutions, but about forging a new and revolutionary ideal of the human being. In an age when a person's identity was completely tied to their city of birth, to be an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian, Diogenes made a declaration that was as shocking as any of his public acts of indecency. When asked what his country was, he did not say Sinope, the city that had exiled him, nor Athens, the city that tolerated him. He replied with a single, world-changing word: cosmopolites. The word literally means citizen of the world. This was not just a clever retort, it was a profound philosophical and political statement. He was rejecting the narrow, tribalistic loyalties of the polis that had been the cause of so much warfare and bloodshed in the Greek world. He was declaring his allegiance not to a particular city or tribe, but to humanity as a whole, and even beyond that, to the rational order of the universe, the cosmos. This was his great construction project, the building of the cosmopolitan man. This ideal human was self-sufficient, relying not on the state for his identity or well-being, but on his own virtue and reason. He was indifferent to local customs and traditions, recognizing them as arbitrary conventions. His only true law was the law of nature, and his only true community was the community of all rational beings. This was an idea of breathtaking scope and originality. It laid the intellectual groundwork for much of the Hellenistic philosophy that would follow. The Stoics, in particular, would take Diogenes' concept of the cosmopolitan and develop it into a cornerstone of their own system, arguing that every human being possesses a spark of the divine logos and is a member of a single, universal brotherhood. By detaching human worth from citizenship, Diogenes was performing a radical act of liberation. He was offering a new identity for the millions of people who had been displaced and alienated by the collapse of the old political order. In a world of vast, impersonal empires, the idea that one could be a citizen of the world, that one's home was everywhere and nowhere, was a powerful and comforting message. While Alexander was physically breaking down the walls between cities and cultures through conquest, Diogenes was doing it philosophically, with a single word. He built no monuments of marble, but he constructed an idea that would prove to be more durable than any empire. To truly understand Diogenes, we must descend into the gritty, tactile details of his daily existence, the onions and vegetables of his philosophy and practice. His entire life was a performance, and every detail was a part of the message. Central to this was his full and enthusiastic embrace of the nickname that was meant as an insult: the dog, ho kuan. When his detractors called him a dog, he would simply agree, saying he was the kind of dog who fawns on those who give him something, barks at those who don't, and bites the rascals. He turned the insult into a philosophy. Cynicism, from the Greek kynikos, the dog-like one. He argued that dogs were superior to humans in many ways. They live in the present. They are free from anxiety about the future. They eat when they are hungry. They sleep when they are tired. And they know their true friends and enemies instinctively. To live like a dog was to live honestly and naturally, without the hypocrisy and artifice of human society. His material possessions were a testament to this radical simplicity. For most of his life, he owned only 3 things: a rough woolen cloak, tribon, which served as his clothing, his blanket, and his shroud; a sturdy wooden staff, for walking and for self-defense, and a simple wooden bowl for drinking. The story of the bowl is particularly telling. One day, Diogenes saw a young boy drinking water from his cupped hands at a fountain. He watched the boy for a moment, and then, with a sense of profound revelation, he threw his own bowl away, exclaiming, "A child has beaten me in simplicity of living." This was not just an act of renunciation. It was a demonstration of his commitment to constant self-examination and improvement on his chosen path. He was always looking for a way to need even less, to become even freer. His wit was as sharp as his lifestyle was austere. His sayings, known as trei, were collected and repeated throughout the ancient world. They were short, biting, and always aimed at puncturing pomposity. When asked where he would like to be buried, he replied, "Just throw me over the city wall, so that wild animals could feast on his body." When his friends objected, he told them to give him his staff so he could wave the animals away. "But you will be unconscious," they protested. "Then what do I care what happens to me?" he retorted. This was Diogenes in full: the biting wit, the relentless logic, and the absolute fearlessness in the face of life's greatest and smallest conventions. For decades, Diogenes lived this life of curated hardship and philosophical warfare, a fixed and famous feature of the Athenian and Corinthian landscapes. He seemed to exist outside the normal flow of human events, an untouchable sage, protected by his own poverty and wit. But the real world, with its chaos and violence, has a way of intruding upon even the most well-fortified philosophical citadels. The first harbinger of a new storm, a new and final chapter in his life, came not from a philosophical rival or an angry politician, but from the brutal and unpredictable reality of the ancient Mediterranean. The story, likely embellished but containing a core of truth, tells that Diogenes, on a sea voyage to the island of Aegina, was captured by pirates. In an instant, his entire world was turned upside down. The man who had mastered his own will was now completely subject to the will of others. The philosopher of freedom was now a piece of human chattel, a slave, bound and destined for the market. This was the ultimate test. Was his freedom, his autarkia, merely a state of mind, an illusion that could be shattered by brute force? Was his entire life's work, his carefully constructed invulnerability, about to be exposed as a fraud? One can imagine him in the hold of the pirate ship, surrounded by the weeping and terrified fellow captives. But Diogenes, according to the legend, did not weep. He remained himself, even in chains. He chided the pirates for their profession and behaved not as a captive, but as a man who was still somehow in charge. This incident, his capture, threatened to be the great refutation of his philosophy. It demonstrated that no matter how much you control your own desires, you cannot control the actions of others. The world can still reach out and crush you. It was a moment of profound crisis, a crack in the ceramic jar of his self-sufficient world. But for Diogenes, a crisis was never just a crisis. It was an opportunity. He was about to turn the greatest catastrophe of his life into the most powerful demonstration of his core belief. The slave market awaited, and Diogenes was preparing for one last great performance. The scene shifts to the slave market in Corinth, a place of human misery and degradation. Here, captured people were displayed like livestock, their bodies prodded, their teeth inspected, their skills and histories reduced to a price. Diogenes, the philosopher of freedom, now stood on the auction block, a living embodiment of the ultimate loss of freedom. The pirate auctioneer, hoping to fetch a good price for this strange, defiant old man, asked him the standard question posed to skilled captives. "What can you do?" This was the fateful moment, the pivot upon which this final act of his life would turn. A normal man would have pleaded for mercy, or perhaps listed some practical skill. "I am a scribe. I am a carpenter." Diogenes did neither. He looked out at the crowd of potential buyers, men of wealth and property, and with an air of absolute authority, he gave an answer of such breathtaking arrogance and genius that it has echoed through history. He pointed to a wealthy Corinthian in the crowd, a well-dressed man named Xeniades, and he declared, "Sell me to that man. He needs a master." It was an act of pure psychological jujitsu. In the very moment of his complete and utter powerlessness, he seized absolute power. He was not the one being sold. He was the one choosing his buyer. He was not offering a skill. He was offering to rule. The audacity of the statement was so shocking, so utterly unexpected, that Xeniades was intrigued. Who was this slave who claimed he could govern men? He approached Diogenes and bought him, not out of a need for a servant, but out of sheer, baffled curiosity. This was the fateful act, the decision that transformed the catastrophe of his enslavement into a new and final stage for his philosophical theater. He could have resisted. He could have despaired. He could have been broken. Instead, he leaned into the disaster. He understood that true freedom and true authority do not reside in legal status or external circumstances, but in wisdom and virtue. He would prove that even a slave, if he is a wise man, is the true master, and that a master, if he is a fool, is the true slave. The slave market was not his defeat, it was his coronation. The purchase by Xeniades was not the end of Diogenes' story, but the beginning of its most paradoxical and perhaps most profound chapter. What should have been the greatest catastrophe of his life, to end his days as a slave, became, in a strange way, the ultimate proof of his philosophy. Xeniades brought Diogenes back to his home in Corinth, and, recognizing the extraordinary nature of his new property, did not put him to work in the fields or the kitchens. Instead, he entrusted him with the most important task in any noble household, the education of his children. And so, Diogenes of Sinope, the man who lived in a jar and barked at society, became the teacher of princes, a live-in sage in a wealthy Corinthian home. The irony was immense, but the opportunity was perfect. He now had a captive audience and a new mission: to instill his principles of virtue, simplicity, and self-control into the next generation. Accounts say he was a demanding but brilliant teacher. He taught the boys not just the traditional subjects, but also the Cynic way of life. He made them exercise, hunt, and live simply. He taught them to be hardy, to wear simple clothing, and to be content with little. He was, in effect, attempting to create living examples of his philosophy, to prove that his ideals could be taught and could create virtuous, self-reliant men. In this, he proved his own audacious claim at the slave market. He was, in fact, governing men. He ruled the household of Xeniades, not through force or legal authority, but through the sheer power of his intellect and the integrity of his character. Xeniades himself would later say that a good spirit had entered his house on the day Diogenes arrived. This final chapter reframes the entire narrative. The catastrophe of his enslavement became the ultimate validation of his core belief that the wise man is the only one who is truly free and the only one fit to rule. His status as a slave was legally true, but practically and spiritually false. He had proven that inner freedom, the freedom from desire, fear, and ignorance, was the only freedom that mattered, a treasure that no pirate could steal and no slave market could sell. He had taken the worst hand that fate could deal him and had used it to win the game. While Diogenes was living out the final paradoxical act of his life as a slave master in Corinth, the world outside was undergoing a political convulsion on a scale unseen for generations. The slow collapse of the old order had turned into a violent, world-shattering avalanche. In 336 BC, the same year as Diogenes' famous encounter with Alexander, King Philip of Macedon was assassinated, the victim of a conspiracy at his own daughter's wedding. The assassination threw the newly forged Macedonian hegemony into chaos. The subject Greek states, particularly Thebes, saw their chance to rebel, to throw off the yoke of the barbarians from the north. But they had underestimated the heir. Philip's son, Alexander, then only 20, moved with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned the world. In a lightning campaign, he marched south, and when Thebes refused to yield, he made a terrifying example of it. He razed the city to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, and sold its 30,000 inhabitants into slavery. The message was brutally clear. The old world of the independent, squabbling polis was dead, and a new, terrible power was in charge. With Greece now cowed into submission, Alexander turned his eyes eastward, to the great, sprawling, ancient enemy, the Persian Empire. This was the beginning of the great campaign that would take him to the edge of the known world, that would dismantle one of the world's oldest empires, and that would inaugurate a new historical epoch, the Hellenistic Age. This was the political backdrop for the final years of Diogenes. The world he had spent his life critiquing was being violently erased and redrawn. The intimate, face-to-face society of the polis, which had been the target of his philosophical performances, was being absorbed into a vast, multicultural, monarchical empire. This collapse of the old world, in a way, made Diogenes' philosophy more relevant than ever. In a world where your city could be destroyed overnight and your entire people sold into slavery, what was the value of patriotism or civic duty? In a world ruled by an absolute monarch thousands of miles away, what was the meaning of political freedom? Diogenes had been preaching for decades that the only true kingdom was the one within, that the only true freedom was freedom from want. As the external world became more chaotic, more violent, and more unpredictable, his message of inner resilience and self-sufficiency began to sound less like the ravings of a madman and more like a necessary strategy for survival. The end for Diogenes, like his life, is shrouded in legend, a collection of dramatic and often contradictory stories, each with its own philosophical moral. He died in Corinth, old and full of years, around 323 BC. By a remarkable coincidence of history, this is the very same year that his great counterpart, Alexander the Great, died of a fever in far-off Babylon. The king who conquered the world and the philosopher who renounced it left the stage of history together. The accounts of his death are a final testament to his philosophy. One story claims he simply decided to die and held his breath until he expired, a final, supreme act of willpower and control over his own body. Another, more in keeping with his dog-like persona, says he died from an infected dog bite or from eating a raw octopus. Perhaps the most likely story is simply that he succumbed to old age, a frail body finally giving out. But the manner of his death is less important than his final wishes for his burial. He instructed his friends to do the unthinkable for a Greek, to simply throw his body over the city walls, unburied, to be devoured by the wild animals. This was his last act of defacing the currency, his final rejection of human custom and religious piety. The proper burial of the dead was one of the most sacred duties in Greek culture. To To leave a body for the dogs and vultures was the ultimate desecration. For Diogenes, however, it was the ultimate act of living and dying according to nature. He saw no difference between his body and the body of an animal, and he wanted to return his physical matter to the great cycle of nature as directly as possible. He was making a final, silent statement that all the elaborate rituals and tombs of humanity were just vanity, a foolish attempt to deny the simple, biological reality of death. In the end, the Corinthians, who had come to respect and even love their resident gadfly, disregarded his wishes. They buried him honorably near the city gate and erected a marble column in his memory, topped with a statue of a dog, the faithful guardian of his final resting place and the enduring symbol of his life's philosophy. The death of Diogenes did not silence him. In fact, it was only the beginning of his long and contentious afterlife. His legacy immediately became a battleground, a conflict of interpretations that has continued for over 2 millennia. For many of his contemporaries and for centuries of detractors, he was nothing more than a crude provocateur, a mentally ill exhibitionist whose philosophy was a flimsy excuse for antisocial behavior. They saw him as a symbol of anarchy, a figure who sought to tear down the very foundations of civilization, family, state, religion, and property, without offering anything constructive in their place. They pointed to his shamelessness, his obscenity, his scorn for all authority, and saw him as a dangerous and corrupting influence, a buffoon at best, a nihilist at worst. For these critics, his life was not a lesson in freedom, but a cautionary tale about what happens when a man abandons all restraint and decency. However, a powerful and influential counter-narrative also emerged, one that saw Diogenes not as a madman, but as a saint of reason, a heroic figure of immense spiritual courage. This interpretation was most powerfully advanced by the Stoics, who saw Diogenes and the Cynics as their philosophical forefathers. The Stoics, like Zeno of Citium, who founded the school a generation after Diogenes' death, sanitized the Cynic message, stripping it of its most shocking and performative elements. But they revered Diogenes himself. They saw him as a man who had actually achieved the ideal of the sage, the wise man who is completely indifferent to external circumstances. They called his life a shortcut to virtue. While others had to read long books and study complex theories to understand the path to wisdom, Diogenes had simply lived it. For the Stoics, and for many who followed, Diogenes was a role model, a practical demonstration that it is possible for a human being to achieve perfect freedom and happiness through the exercise of reason and the rejection of false values. This conflict continues to this day. Is Diogenes a hero or a villain, a sage or a lunatic, a liberating prophet of individualism or a corrosive force of pure negativity? The answer, perhaps, is that he was all of these things, a figure too large and too contradictory to be confined to any single interpretation. He remains a mirror, reflecting back the values and anxieties of whoever looks into his story. We must now return to the central dramatic paradox, the core question that has driven our narrative. Why did a wise man live in a barrel and laugh at kings? The final comprehensive answer is that he lived in the barrel because he was a wise man, and he laughed at kings because his life in that barrel had given him a perspective from which a king's power looks like a child's game. His life was not an escape from the world, but a direct and sustained assault upon it. The Pythos was not a home, it was a fortress and a pulpit. It was a deliberate, rational, and brilliantly effective piece of philosophical performance art designed to expose the madness of the world around him. He understood a profound truth, that modern life, even in ancient Athens, is a kind of trap. We are born into a web of conventions, desires, and expectations that are not of our own making. We are taught to want things, wealth, status, power, comfort, and we spend our entire lives chasing them, believing that they will bring us happiness. But Diogenes saw that this chase was a source of endless misery. The desire for wealth makes you a slave to your possessions. The desire for status makes you a slave to the opinions of others. The desire for power makes you a slave to your own ambition and fear. He solved this paradox by performing a radical inversion. Instead of trying to gain freedom by acquiring more, he would gain it by desiring less. By systematically renouncing everything that society values, he made himself immune to its power. He was free because there was nothing anyone could take from him, and nothing anyone could offer him that he wanted. This is why Alexander, the master of the world, had no power over him. Alexander could offer wealth, fame, and position, all the things Diogenes had already identified as worthless chains. The only thing the king could do was block the sunlight, a natural good that belonged to everyone and no one. Diogenes's poverty was not a deprivation, it was a weapon. It was the source of his courage, his wit, and his profound and unsettling freedom. He lived in the gutter to gain a clearer view of the stars, and what he saw from that vantage point was the comical absurdity of human striving. What, then, is the universal lesson of this strange and provocative life? What is the verdict of history on the man who called himself the dog? The story of Diogenes is a timeless and universal parable about the eternal conflict between the individual and the collective, between the sovereign self and the demands of society. He is the ultimate symbol of dissent, the patron saint of all those who have ever looked at the world and thought, "This is all mad." His life is a testament to the fact that the most powerful prison is not one with iron bars, but the one we build for ourselves out of our own desires and our fear of what others think. He teaches us that true freedom is not a political status or an economic condition, but an inner achievement. It is the liberation of the mind from the tyranny of opinion, the liberation of the soul from the slavery of want. Diogenes represents a fork in the road of Western thought. One path, taken by his great rival Plato, leads to the creation of ideal republics, to the building of systems, to the belief that human happiness can be engineered through laws, institutions, and the proper ordering of society. The other path, the Cynic path, leads inward. It is a path of subtraction, not addition, of deconstruction, not construction. It argues that the good life is not found by changing the world, but by changing oneself. It is a philosophy of resilience, a toolkit for surviving with one's integrity intact in a world that is often corrupt, foolish, and hostile to truth. The verdict of history is this: while we have built our societies largely on the model of Plato, with its hierarchies, laws, and ambitions, we have never been able to completely silence the barking of Diogenes from his barrel. He remains as a permanent and necessary irritant, the nagging voice that reminds us to question our assumptions, to examine our desires, and to ask ourselves, with every frantic step we take up the ladder of success, whether we are not simply blocking our own light. And so, we are left with a final frame, a powerful and enduring image that stays with the viewer long after the story is told. It is not the image of the old man in the sun, nor the slave on the auction block. It is the image of the lantern. The physical flame held in Diogenes's hand was small, weak, and almost invisible in the bright Athenian sun. It was an object of ridicule, a symbol of his apparent madness. But the metaphorical light from that lantern has not been extinguished. It flickers down through the corridors of time, a tiny, persistent flame, passed from hand to hand by rebels, artists, philosophers, and saints. It is an echo, a question that still hangs in the air of our own crowded, noisy, and brilliantly lit marketplaces. The lantern's light illuminates the uncomfortable truth that our progress, our technology, our wealth, and our power have not necessarily made us more honest, more virtuous, or more human. It challenges every generation to conduct its own search, to peer into the faces of its leaders, its celebrities, its experts, and into its own face in the mirror, and to ask the same simple, devastating question. In this blinding glare of information and ambition, in this world of manufactured images and carefully constructed identities, where is the authentic human being? Diogenes never found his honest man. The search, he implies, is the point. And his lantern, a small flame of defiant inquiry against a world of overwhelming and often blinding certainty, continues to burn.